Merry Christmas? Really? Really? That's the best you've got? Merry Christmas. Thank you. I mean, we're ready to finish this thing up. This is, in case you don't know, this is our last Sunday service, literally the last Sunday service for 2013. We take the Sunday off between Christmas and New Year, so a week from today, if you are around, feel free to go visit other churches. Just go enjoy God in creation. Many of you and us will be with family and friends, so take advantage of that. However, this Tuesday night, if you're still in town, anyone still in town Tuesday night? Anybody? Awesome. 5 o'clock to 5:30 right here. We will do a Christmas Eve service. Brad will do some traditional Christmas songs. I'll do a traditional Christmas devotion. And it'll be about 30 minutes. We'll have some cookies and some drinks afterwards. It'll be really brief, and then we'll just bless you to go enjoy the rest of Christmas Eve and Christmas Day with your friends and family. And then it'll be kind of like see you later in 2014. We're excited about what is ahead. I will wrap up in just a moment this Christmas series we've been calling Light. I'll do that in just a moment. But just to say, so grateful, and I know I speak on the rest of our staff's behalf. We're so grateful for what God has done in our church this year. I'll recap some of those things in my message this morning, but we're just so grateful for what God has done. You know, really, in case you don't know, Epic Church is just, we'll hit our 3rd birthday in February, so we're planning a grand celebration for that. But since the inception of Epic Church, even before we had our first service, these are the places where I recorded all of my thoughts, all right? So if you wanted to know anything about me, my plans, my aspirations, what breaks my heart, what did I pray for, which staff member did I want to fire when they made it, I'm just kidding. But if you want it, so I hope that you get to know me a little bit up here from the talks I give weekly through the teaching ministry of Epic, and certainly many of you personally, and so you've got to know a lot about me. But if you really wanted to get to know me, these are the places where I have most fully expressed myself. Some of you are like, Ben, that's dangerous. I keep all of that right here, so no one can ever steal it. We've had a security guard standing around these all morning, so you could destroy me. Now, just so you know, if you do steal this, and there are curses invoked on your name, just know it's not you, Chris. It's a different Chris. It is not you at all. But this is where I have chosen to most fully express myself. This is, I go a few places without these. I'll be traveling with one, like my current one. I just start them. I date it where I start the actual journal, and then I close it out on the last day. And then I keep them in order so I can go back and see what was going on in my life. But if you really wanted to know me, really reading these would give you probably the fullest expression of who I am. Now, one thing we've been talking about in this series is how do we get to know God? And the question I want to ask us to lead off with this morning is this: how has God fully expressed himself? If I were to ask you that question, we were to banter back and forth, you would name a few things, I think, and maybe some of them would be the following. We would say that God has expressed himself in creation or in nature, and that's true, right? I hope you all got outside yesterday. Did get outside yesterday at all? Anybody? It's like, this is awesome. This is great. I haven't seen the fog in like forever. It is just beautiful. But we see God's expression of himself in the beauty of his creation, in the beauty of nature. God has revealed himself. The Bible even mentions that. You might say that then God has revealed himself through the 10 Commandments. And I would say absolutely. In the 10 Commandments, you see what God really is about, what he's for, and what he's against, right? He says things like, I'm a one God kind of God, right? He says things like, you need to honor your parents. You don't need to commit adultery, on and on and on. And so God reveals partly who he is. He expresses himself in the 10 Commandments. But he also does this through the prophets, right? In case you aren't clear, what the prophets did and what we call our Old Testament, the prophets would get a word from God and they would express that to a particular group of people at a particular time. But what they were expressing was God's heart or God's desire, what it was that God wanted people to stop doing or to start doing. That's what a prophet would do. He would express who God is and what he wants. You could even say that God has expressed himself in us. in the very first chapter of the Bible, in Genesis chapter 1, it tells us that you and I were made in the what? In the image of God. And so, though it's hard to see for me sometimes, like I'm not sure there's any God-like thing about me, but God has expressed a portion of who he is just in creating you. Just the fact that you exist, you display, we are image bearers of God, so he's expressed himself in that way. And of course, the most popular answer, if I were to say, how has God fully expressed himself? Probably the most popular answer would be in the Bible, right? We believe that absolutely that's true, that God, through men and women, he spoke through men and women who wrote so that even us today, we would be able to see who God is and see how he has expressed himself. But what I want to do today is look at what I believe, and I think the scriptures teach this too. I'm going to look at what I believe is the clearest and most fullest expression of God himself. So if you have a Bible, we're in John chapter 1. If you need a Bible, lift a hand, and we've got volunteers ready to place one into your hands. Keep those hands high. This is our gift to you. If you need a different kind, larger print, whatever the case may be, let us know. We'd be glad to buy you your own Bible. We've got one hand over this way to my left. It's a couple, yep. Keep rolling with it, guys. That's right. And I'll tell you what page number we're on in just a minute. Keep those hands high. They will get to you. For the rest of us, John chapter 1, we'll start in verse 14. If you have one of the gift Bibles that we've just passed out, we're on page 576, I believe. So would you all stand with me? I want to teach from this text John has given us. This is going to wrap up our Christmas series that we're calling Light. And John, the one who's written these words, he is one of the 12 disciples. He's, along with his brother James and Peter, one of the kind of inner three disciples, really unique relationship. He's known as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Wouldn't you love to put that on your business card? Like, I know he loves the whole world, so you're included, but he loves me best. That'd be pretty good. But that's what he's known for, that he had this unique relationship with Jesus. John did. And here's what he says. In verses 14 through 18, it says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, 'This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me because he was before me.'" That's speaking of John the Baptist, not this John. "For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." You can be seated. He has made him known. It would not be surprising to know that every one of us in here, even if it's just from Christmas carols themselves, we get that some idea about Christmas has to do with the reality that there's this manger scene going on, right? If we just use songs alone, everybody, it's a silent night, O come, Emmanuel. All of those, just from the songs, we know that there's something about this baby Jesus coming into existence that's very significant. But I hope to take it to a whole new place of significance in my mind and in your mind. That's what's happened for me, even getting ready for this morning. Here's what John says. He says, "And the Word was made flesh." The Word is a title John continues to give to Jesus. And here's what the word means. It's this word logos in the Greek. And it means basically that the Word, Jesus, is God's divine self-expression. Jesus is the divine self-expression of God, that God, when he chose how he would express himself, we mentioned many of these a moment ago. He would do so in creation. He would do so through prophets. He would do so through me and you. He would do so through the Bibles. But the divine self-expression of God, I believe, is most fully embodied in the person of Jesus. And that's what John is saying. The Word became flesh. That's this thing you've heard before. It's called the incarnation. The idea is to incarnate. It literally means to put meat on or to put skin on. And one of the disadvantages that you and I have is this. We know this story. Many of us know this story. And so we cease sometimes to be astounded by what we already know to be true. But imagine that you heard about there was a God who existed. He was your creator. He brought prophets, and they would speak things, and you would understand somewhat what God is like. You would be familiar with the 10 Commandments, but then all of a sudden that God chose to put skin on and come live among you. That would be a big deal, wouldn't it? And sometimes we look back, and so we don't get to enjoy the wonder and just how astounding it is that what John is saying is true, that Emmanuel, God has come to be with us. He says, and the Word became flesh. He's not saying that Jesus came onto the scene for the first time in his existence, but for the first time ever, Jesus puts on flesh, and this is what we call the incarnation. Here's what J.I. Packer says in his brilliant book, Knowing God. I'd recommend that book to you. It's not a Christmas book, but he brings this idea to bear. And he says, nothing in fiction is so fantastic as is this truth of the incarnation. Nothing in fiction, there's never been a story or a movie made that's so amazing as the reality that God comes and puts on flesh. That God would come and he would become one of us. And if you're thinking, like, what's the big deal? Well, here's what Isaiah said. Remember this idea of John saying that Jesus came to be among us. But Isaiah had prophesied some 700 years before Jesus was born, saying, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given. There's this to us part in play that's massive. He's saying God has become one of us. God has become one of us. Here's what Tim Keller says about the incarnation. Keller, in his book, The Reason for God, he says and this will sound like heresy in some ways, but he says in the most radical way, God has adjusted to us in his incarnation and atonement. In the most profound way, God has said to us in Christ, I will adjust to you, I will change for you. Now, here's the part that could be heretical. He's not saying that God is submitting to us. He's not saying that I will adjust to your ideas about what kind of God I should be. He's saying this, because I want reconciliation with you. Remember, we had this perfect harmony in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve, they're walking with God in the cool of the day. There's no separation between God and humanity at that moment. Adam and Eve have this relationship with God, and there's nothing between them. So they don't have any clothes on, not a big deal, right? There's nothing between them. There's no shame. There's no separation. But when they decide to go their own way, all of a sudden separation comes in. God calls it sin. Sin comes in. They want something that they think is better than or different from God. They choose their own way. And ever since, there's been this brokenness between God and humanity. There's been this brokenness between God and humanity. But what God knows is for him to win back our hearts, we can't, I hope you know this. You might be a superhero, but we can't become what he is. We can't become what he is. He's something different than us. So there's this great chasm. There's this great divide. So knowing that he wants us back, we can't become what he is, so he becomes what we are. It's astounding. Again, Packer says there's nothing in fiction as amazing as the reality that God would, and if you're like, Ben, what's the big adjustment? I don't get it. Now imagine if you lived in the biggest mansion in San Francisco one day, and the very next day you had no home at all. That would be a pretty major adjustment, right? It wouldn't touch this, though. Imagine you're on a throne one day, angels singing to you, and they sing better than your neighbor at Epic this morning, okay? You're like, oh, that would be terrible. No, it's like this beautiful thing, this glorious thing. And that's your reality. But your Father has a mission. Remember what Paul said in Galatians 4 and 5. He says, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under that same law so that we might receive adoption as sons. That Jesus had to become like us so that what God wanted in the end could be accomplished. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And then John said, and we've seen his glory. Its glory is of the only Son from the Father, full of what? Grace and truth. If you look at the text, there's 5 verses, but he really gets after this combination of full grace and full truth in Jesus. In verse 14, he said that he was full of grace and he was full of truth. At the end of 16, it says, from his fullness, we've all received grace upon grace. In verse 17, he says the law, part of the 10 Commandments we said a second ago, the law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. He's wanting us to know something as he looks back. And remember, John doesn't give us the Christmas events, but he gives us the significance of Christmas. So John is not saying, here's what happened, Mary got pregnant. He leaves that to Matthew and Luke. And you should read the events. They're massive. Chapters 1 and 2, Matthew and Luke. Great. You should familiarize or refamiliarize yourself with that over the next few days. But what John's saying is, hey, I'm not giving you the events of Christmas, but I'm giving you the significance. I'm giving you the weight of Christmas. This is what Jesus is doing. And he says something significant. When he came as one who was full of grace and full of truth. And this is not saying 50% grace Jesus and 50% truth Jesus, but 100% of each. Now, you may wonder, why does John get at this? What's the big deal that he's all grace and he's all truth? Well, here's the big deal. If you only get the truth Jesus or the grace Jesus, you won't have Jesus. Okay? If you only get the truth Jesus, then you know what the standard is. You know God's holy. You know where you've messed up, but you'll be left hopeless. You'll be left hopeless. You'll be right about who he is, about what he commands from us, about how we can't measure up. You'll be right, but you'll just have no hope. Now, if you just get the full grace Jesus, then you'll think that it doesn't matter what you do. Just go live however you want, because you're right about part of it. He's forgiving. He's slow to anger. He's compassionate. But Jesus is full truth, and he's fully gracious. And here's what he's saying. The truth is that God is holy and we are not, but the full grace is that Jesus steps in and fills the gap. The truth is that none of us deserve the riches of God's love, but that's the whole point of grace, isn't it? And you see these two most fully embodied on the cross. On the cross, the truth is that God has to punish sin. That's the truth. For him to be just, for him to be righteous, for him to be holy, he's got to do something with the stuff that isn't holy. That's truth. So the truth is he must punish sin, but grace comes in when God puts skin on and takes the punishment for you. All grace, all truth. My guess is, if you're like me, most of us tend to relate to a grace Jesus or a truth Jesus. One leaves us hopeless, and one, I would say, even leaves us delusional. We know the truth, but we just can't measure up. That's what the law did, right? It revealed God's truth, but we couldn't get there with the law. If we go just grace, and you see that, you can go to churches and find the all-truth Jesus or the all-grace Jesus. Some of us have been in churches like that. But if we just get the all-grace Jesus, and the reality is that, I can do whatever I want. He doesn't even care. It doesn't cost him anything. He's fine with it. Friends, let's relate to Jesus, who is fully grace and fully truth. But he gets this grace, the word grace shows up even more in the text than the word truth does. In verse 16, John says, from his fullness, he's looking back. Remember, John's looking back. And he says, from his fullness, we have just received grace upon grace upon grace. He's saying to us, since Jesus entered the scene, it's been grace after grace after grace. And you see this throughout the life of Jesus, don't you? Because remember, if I express myself here, but God expresses himself through Jesus, and we're going, well, what's God like? Well, he must be a lot like Jesus, right? He's expressing himself through the life of Jesus. So when you see Jesus show up, and a woman's been caught in the act of adultery, the act, not like 2 weeks after, in the act of adultery, and everyone's ready to stone her for her committing that sin that can be punished by death itself, and somehow everyone walks away after setting their stones down. Jesus says to this woman, is there anyone left to condemn you? She says, no. He says, then neither do I. When you see him offering forgiveness rather than condemnation, he's self-expressing the heart of God. When you see Jesus in Luke 15 tell a story that Will taught on just a few weeks ago, talking about a father who gave his inheritance to his youngest son while he was still alive, and the son goes off and he blows it, he squanders it, he makes terrible decisions, and then he kind of comes with his head between his legs back to his dad to become one of his dad's servant. And it says the father runs to him and basically throws a party and gives him expensive gifts when he deserves something different. That's Jesus expressing the gracious heart of God. When you see Jesus come up to Zacchaeus and say, today I'm coming to your house for dinner, even though Zacchaeus is a notorious tax collector, that's Jesus expressing the gracious heart of God. When you see Jesus begin to weep because his friends are brokenhearted, right? He knows he's going to bring Lazarus back from the dead, right? If I'm Jesus, I'm like, hey man, no emotions here. I know how the story ends. But yet he sees his friends brokenhearted over their friend Lazarus, and when he weeps, he's expressing the heart of God, that there's a God who cares deeply about our current circumstances, even though he knows he's going to change them. When you see Jesus pick 12 disciples who wouldn't have made anyone else's all-star team, and he entrusts the whole mission of the kingdom to them, aren't you glad he takes people who don't make all-star teams? You should be, because you're not an all-star, all right? And I'm not either. But he takes us and he makes us something we could never be on our own. He's willing to take chances on us. Jesus expresses the heart of God. When you see Jesus on the cross and he's being mocked, this is the one for me. I've just been reading this lately. Jesus is being mocked. What they are yelling to him, imagine this, okay? I want you to pretend like you're Jesus just for a second. I know it's a stretch, especially for some of you. It's a stretch for all of us. I want you to think that you're Jesus. You've lived a sinless life. You're on the cross. And they begin to mock him. And they say to him, if you're really the Savior of the world, why don't you save yourself? How tempting would that moment have been? If you're really the Savior of the world, why don't you get yourself off the cross? Save yourself. How tempting must that have been? But Jesus, expressing the gracious heart of God, knew that if he saved himself in that moment, he couldn't save us forever. And he does this throughout his whole life. After Jesus dies, and he's raised from the dead 3 days later, I don't know what you would have done with the disciples who left you at your deepest, darkest hour, but what Jesus does is he restores every one of them. Except for Judas. He's not alive anymore at that time. And all throughout the life of Jesus, if he is the self-expression of God, if he is from his fullness giving us grace after grace after grace after grace, he's showing us the heart of God. But I haven't just seen this in Jesus' life, I've seen this in my life. How about you? Because here's the truth for me. The truth for me is that neither of my parents grew up in a Christian family. And yet someday grace invaded their lives in unlikely ways. And now every one of their children, every one of their grandchildren are trying their best to follow Christ. The truth is, my mom died when I was 25 years old. She was only 46. But the grace comes in where God brought unity and peace in our family 3 or 4 years before she passed away. The truth is, I was that rebellious teenager that no one would have dared thought anything good could come from his life. When I was 16, some of you heard this, I was going out with friends, just super rebellious, and we went to a small church, and my mom would pray with a few ladies on Monday nights. And, when you're the rebellious kid, you kind of take the bulk of the prayer requests. Anybody else ever been that kid? You're just like, no, we're not going to pray for the other kids tonight. It's all Ben tonight. But I remember she said to me one day, Ben, I want you to know that the ladies and I, we're praying for you. We believe God can do something great in your life. And I looked back at her, and I said to her, Mom, you can pray all you want to. I'm not going to change a thing. She kept praying, and grace broke in. And 20 years ago, I didn't even want to be in a church, and I sure didn't want to be in this position in the church. But grace is a funny thing. See, the truth is, I have no business being a part of this church, much less leading it. But grace comes in, and it makes impossible things possible. So now I have a wife that I don't deserve, and I have children I don't deserve, and I have friendships with many of you that I don't deserve, and I get to work with an amazing team that I don't deserve, and I get to see God do crazy things day in and day out in people's life that I don't deserve. But I haven't just seen grace in Jesus' life and in my life. I've seen God's grace on display time after time in our church this year. We've seen more people this year come to trust and surrender their lives to Jesus than ever before. Baptized our 40th person of the year last week. Just incredible to see what God's doing. We've seen God's provision. When we began to study this urban church planting reality, we learned from many people that traditionally it takes about 5 years before you can be financially self-sustainable, and yet in about 2.5 years, God brought that to our midst. Not because we deserve it, not because we have this great strategy. Grace after grace after grace. We've seen miracles in our church this year. And I don't mean the kind that you have to wonder, like, Ben, are you sure that's a miracle? I mean the kind that Jesus got credit for. I'll never forget a Sunday back in the spring, Brad and I we needed to go to the hospital because one of the girls who had just actually made the worship team, she basically was paralyzed and wasn't able to walk. And so we go to the hospital. Her dad and mom had flown down from Alaska, where she's from. And, we go and you do, you're the pastor, so you're supposed to pray, and you're supposed to believe, but you're just like, oh, man, this is a terrible situation. But God, would you do something? God, would you do something for her? And weeks later, she actually flies back home to Alaska, and was going to do rehab. And I've just got to be honest with you. I didn't think we'd see her again. I just didn't think that was probably best for her. She's far from home. She needs to be near her family, needs to be close to her parents. And I'll never forget, I was up here just a couple months ago this fall, and she just comes walking in. Why not? Grace upon grace. You know, one of the things with Christmas that you see with John the Baptist's parents and, of course, with Jesus' parents, people getting pregnant who aren't supposed to get pregnant, right? At least not in the ways that with the expectations that people would have, biologically speaking. What's been crazy in our church this year, we've seen this. Dan and Betsy, right, were at our last service. They were told they couldn't have kids, and now they had to each carry one home today because they have two. Miracle stuff. Some friends of mine in the room right now, when I did their premarital counseling and we got to that section, we're like, hey, let's talk about the kid thing. And they're like, oh, we would love kids, but the girl, she just like, hey, I don't know if I can. There's a medical condition. And then they got pregnant, and then a little bit of time after that, they're like, hey, Shauna and I, at the end of a service, they were just bawling. And we're like, oh, man, this can't be good. And certainly it wasn't. There was potentially some disorder with the child. And we began to pray, and gosh, I guess just weeks later, they were like, hey, everything's actually going to be fine, and they're set to deliver their first child in the next 10 days or so. Grace upon grace upon grace. And some of you are like, Ben, that's great for Jesus, and that's great for your church, and that's great for you and your family, but I don't know that thing's available to me. Well, I would just say to you, I don't know what kind of awesome or terrible year you've had, but perhaps the reason you're in this moment with us right now is because this is your grace moment. That God is saying to you, I've not left you in the dark. You don't have to figure out if I exist. I have sent my son. He put on flesh so that you might see what my heart is really like. The prophets got it right. Creation got it right. The Bible gets it right. You're a part of me. You're the image of God. You sort of can display who I am. But I sent Jesus to bridge this great gap. And we've not been left in the dark. Look at what verse 18 says. There's a lot of pronouns at the end of this, so I'll make sure that you understand who he's talking about. Here's what John is saying. No one has ever seen God, but he's saying the only God, he's calling Jesus that, Jesus as God. The only God, Jesus, who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. He's saying to us, Jesus has made God known. You're not in the dark anymore. Continue to be curious, but you're not left with you're not left without any answers. Listen to what a couple of other writers in the Bible said about the same thing, really the significance of Christmas. Here's what the author of Hebrews says, Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3. Listen in, because this is just astounding stuff to me. The author of Hebrews says that Jesus is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he's set down at the right hand of the majesty on high. It's a packed verse, isn't it? Listen to what he says. Jesus is the radiance, so he's the light. He is coming in a majestic way, showing us who God is and what he's like. And he says that Jesus is the exact imprint of his nature. He's saying he's not some cheap knockoff. You ever been other places where they sold knockoff things of the real thing, and you thought you were getting a great deal? And you got home and somebody's like, no, man, it was 90% off because it's not real. Or you've copied something by hand, or if you remember like the old copy machines or printers, and you're like, that doesn't really look like the original. It's saying Jesus isn't a knockoff. Hear that phrase, exact imprint of the nature of God. And it says about Jesus that he didn't just come to show us what God is like. He came to show us how far God would go to get us back when it says that he made purification for sins. Because here's the reality. The manger never enters God's mind and heart without the cross being there simultaneously. This isn't about some great folklore or fable or about something that makes you think about childhood. I hope it does those things. I hope it makes you think about your favorite Christmas songs. But this isn't just to give us some tunes. And this isn't just to give us a break from work and school annually. And the Christmas thing was always in God's heart about eventually a mission that would land on a cross. That's always been God's heart. Listen to what Paul says to those in the town of Colossae. Here's what Paul says. You'll see it on the screen. Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 20. Here's what's going to happen. There are many pronouns in here, so where it's talking about Jesus, I'm just going to use his name, if that's okay. Permission granted. Thank you. All right, here's what he's saying. This is weighty stuff. Here's what he says. Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by Jesus all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through Jesus and for Jesus, all things. And he, Jesus, is before all things, and in Jesus all things hold together. And Jesus is the head of the body, the church. Jesus is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything Jesus might be preeminent. That's why we orient our entire lives around him. For in Jesus all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through Jesus to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. God's self-expression. Not a bad resume, right? He's the image of the invisible God. John said what? No one has ever seen God, but Jesus has made him known. Hebrews said Jesus was the exact imprint of the nature of God. And Paul says to the Colossians that he is the image of the invisible God, that he was there at the creation party. Everything was not just created by him, but it was created through him, and it was created for him. It was created for him. And then he says he's the head of the church. And then he gets into verse 19 and he says, for in Jesus, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Now, do you see why I'm making the point this morning that the full expression of God is most fully expressed, I know redundancy, most fully expressed in Jesus? Paul's trying to make sure you understand that all of God was pleased to dwell in Jesus. So instead of just saying all of God, he says all the what? Fullness. You're like, Paul, we get it, man. He's like, no, I want to make sure you understand. God was pleased. This was God's plan. God was pleased for all of his fullness to dwell in Jesus, so that Jesus might reconcile all things through the cross. Through the cross. So when you see Jesus coming as a baby, that's not mission complete. For him to fully express who God was, the cross was necessary. Had he simply lived his life, we would have, just like so many other things, we would have got a hint of who God is and what he's like, but we would not have grasped what he was willing to do to win our hearts back as children. The cross is necessary for Jesus to fully express God's heart for us. And so he says what? That he went to the cross so that all things might be reconciled. So that the separation between us and God would be bridged, would be closed. So that the distance because of our sin and the holiness of God would be bridged. And God, he adjusts for us. He becomes human for us so that we might know what he's like. And here's what John said a couple verses earlier than our text this morning in chapter 1, verse 12. John said, to all who received him as he is, to all who believed in his name as he represents, he gave the right to become children of God. Now, when someone fully expresses their heart to you, there are bad ways you can respond, right? Someone fully expresses their heart to you, and you're like, is that all? Right? A man, ladies, he confesses his undying love for you. You're like, okay, are we eating tonight? I mean, what's going on? This morning, you're no longer in the dark. God has fully expressed himself in the person of Jesus. But self-expressions like this really demand and dictate a response. Friends, let me say this. If Jesus isn't all of the things that we've said this morning, then he's really not that significant of a player in history. He belongs with the rest of good teachers and decent prophets and really moral people. But if he is, well, even with all the distractions in my life, I can't just go on living as if it's not true. Christmas changes everything. God steps into human history as a human, destined not for a manger ultimately, but for a cross, to win our hearts back so that you and I could be sons and daughters, like forever. And I know that we're all over the map spiritually this morning, where we're at on our journey. Some of you are coming back to faith. Some of you have just you've been stable in your faith. We admire people like you. For many of us, it kind of comes and goes. And others of you are brand new to this, and you're just here because someone's promised you brunch or something afterwards. He came among us. He came to us to win our hearts. And as Packer said, there's nothing in fiction so fantastic as is this truth of the incarnation. No matter how creative you are, you can't write a better script. Full truth, full grace, making a way for you. Truth says, listen, you turned your back on God. Grace says he still came for you. Truth said you blew what he gave you, like I have and so many others. Grace says here's a second chance and a third chance and a 12th chance and on and on and on. Aren't you glad? Would you all pray with me this morning? I'm going to have our band come up and lead us in a couple of songs just to really close out the series, close out this year of Sundays where we've seen God do some tremendous things. Don't miss this season. Don't let it just be, it's another Christmas time, it's a great season, I get a break, I see family. Jesus has come for more than that. He's come to self-express the heart of God to us. Let's receive that from him, even if it's for the first time this season. God, I thank you that you have expressed yourself fully in the person of Jesus. I thank you for all of the ways that you've revealed yourself. I know creation does so. I know the prophets did, things like the Ten Commandments. God, even we are your image bearers, but nothing in all of creation, in all of history has revealed you like Jesus has. May we be astounded that you would adjust to us, that you would give, God, that you would give your son Jesus a mission that would be very costly to him and very freeing to us. We don't want to hear that in vain this morning. God, we want to respond, and we want to receive you, Jesus, as you are. Very God, putting on skin, living a meager existence, choosing 12 men who would take forever to get it right, going to a cross, being mocked. Why don't you come down and save yourself? And yet you remained, not saving yourself so that you could save us. Save us from our sin and the penalty and punishment of that sin. Jesus, we're grateful. You've brought hope to us, and I pray that we wouldn't spurn that. God, I pray that we wouldn't reject that. God, you know where all of our hearts and all of our minds are. God, you know how much faith or how little or how non-existent our faith is. But God, may we fully see. We're not in the dark. You've turned the light on. You've overcome so much. You've come to make us sons and daughters. And we rest in that and we rejoice in that this Christmas. In Jesus' name, amen. Would you stand with me? Let's respond. We'll sing a couple songs just declaring this reality.